Good afternoon, and welcome once again to the Schooler Institute on Preaching at MTSO. Good to have all of you gathered in this way. We're in week 3 of a series of conversations with MTSO alums around what it means to preach, to lead worship, and to be church during a pandemic and in these post-pandemic, hopefully, days that we're in. We've had rich conversations thus far. Much appreciation to Colleen Ogle from Bexley, Ohio, and Nate Adams from Denver, Colorado in week 1. Grace and Matthew and Chris George from Chicago and Atlanta, respectively, joined us last week. Today, we have 2 folks who I'll let introduce themselves in a short while, but TaNikka Sheppard and Andy Call. TaNikka from Miami Gardens, Andy from Cleveland Heights. You'll get to know a little bit more about them in a few moments. We've been working on and working at, as I said, what it means to be at the homiletical task and to lead in worship in these days. We've talked a little bit about some of the very practical kinds of things that happen to us and so many of you and so many others in the church and in the world around us in the early days of the pandemic, how we responded, the changes along the way, some of the challenges just to the pragmatics of doing this work, some of the problems and conundrums that arose, things we would not have expected, reactions from our people, reactions in our own selves. We've worked a little bit at that, began last week pushing a little bit more into the actual preaching task and asking ourselves some theological questions. I hope all of you who are participating are doing that kind of thinking yourself and maybe getting some thoughts into the chat. Get your thinking out in that format. Also, use the Q&A to get some questions going. We will dedicate the last 25 to 30 minutes to some question answer time, but it doesn't have to be a linear process. If you have a burning question, get it in that Q&A early and we'll try and look at it. We'll keep one eye on that as we're talking and try and find a way to fit those questions in as we go. But let's get started. TaNikka, I'll start with you. Let us know a little bit about who you are and your ministry setting.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure. Hopefully you all can hear me. And I serve at the Fountain Church in Miami Gardens as the executive pastor. And it's a bit interesting because I moved here in the middle of the pandemic in November of 2020. So this is a newer position for me. But my job is comprised of leading our ministry and administration areas, which include worship, as well as children, youth, community, and most of the other things I think. But it is always a pleasure. There is a challenge in serving, but as I said, I'm newer to this area and to this position, as I had most of the years where I served were in Ohio, specifically in Columbus. So I am in a time of learning and growth.
Thank you. Andy, tell us a little bit about yourself and your context for ministry.
Well, first of all, I have to say that TaNikka, it sounds like you made a great choice. As I woke up this morning and there was ice all over my front step at the very end of March, Miami Gardens sounds like a great place to be. So I've been here at Church of the Saviour in Cleveland Heights. Been in the lead pastor role for 5 years. Been here at Church of the Saviour for 7 altogether. This is a suburban congregation, inner ring suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. We are up the hill from downtown Cleveland, which is why it's called Cleveland Heights. We have very creative names for our communities on the east side of Cleveland. This is an 1,100 member congregation with a long history of both in terms of its ministry and witness in this community, and in its mission and service throughout the world. And so it's an exciting place to do ministry. It's also a place, as these anchor institutions, these long storied congregations in urban suburban settings can be. It's a congregation with a rich tradition who hold on to that tradition very much.
Memory is a wonderful and many layered thing for church. Well, welcome to you both. Want to jump in a little bit and just get us started with what it means. You've told us about your place and your space and a little bit about your ministry. Want to push right into what it means for you now to be in ministry. Andy, I'm going to turn to you first. I remember when both of you came to MTSO as students, and I remember something about each of you while you were students. So I'm going to ask you each this question. I'll start with you, Andy. When you came to the school and were answering a call to ministry, I suspect you were answering a call into the call of God on our lives comes in a number of different ways. But I suspect you were feeling called into a church that was quite a bit different. The one that I was called into in the 1980s. I entered seminary in the early to mid 1980s. Different time, different place. I doubt even then, when you started 10, 11 years ago, maybe longer now, I can't remember, that you could have imagined what we would have been through the last couple of years. So my question is, now after 2 years of the church really going through remarkable things, we'll get to talking about some of the changes in our world going around us that impact church. But just in the way the pandemic has changed how we do church, would you do this again? And keep in mind, we might have some seminary students. I see them the same way I saw the two of you before. So be gentle with them. But would you do this again?
That's a really great question. First of all, any conversation about responding to a call to ministry and being a student at MTSO would be incomplete if I didn't name April Casperson. She's well used to this trope by now, but I tell people that she is the reason that I am an elder in the United Methodist Church today. I actually started at MTSO with the intent that I was going to do some basic graduate theological studies and be ordained as a deacon to do music and worship in the life of the church. April was one of those people who helped me to see that an MDiv was within my reach, and that has led to a journey that is not what I would have expected, but has also been a very rewarding and joyful one. I think the short answer to your question, Jay, is I think I would do it again, because I don't sense that the call of God on my life at this point in ministry is diminished. I think the vocation is remarkably different. Who could have imagined in just over a decade how much congregational life would have changed? In particular, this is true for me, different from you, TaNikka, in that being in the United Methodist Church with all the things that have happened in the United Methodist Church and where we are at this point in time. But ministry has shifted dramatically just within the last 2 years, certainly, but it was already shifting pretty dramatically in the 2 years before that. So it is a challenging time, and yet I don't sense any less God's presence and call on my life in this. Would I have maybe thought differently about the call if I knew where that was going to go? Certainly. And I think at any point in our lives, if we knew how the whole thing was going to unfold, we might just close ourselves in the room and throw the blankets back over our head. But I do think that God's presence continues to be with me through this time, and I give thanks for the grace that keeps our church where it is, even though we have a long way to go.
Thank you. TaNikka, I'll ask you the same thing. And I think most of us probably think about all baptized Christians being called to ministry. We're all in ministry with one another in the church and in the world around us. But there is something unique about a call to ordained ministry, and you heard that call and followed it. I imagine you didn't expect you to end up in South Florida when you accepted that call, and that's probably the case for most of us. That the call that brings us into ministry isn't necessarily the call that takes us to new places and keeps us at the work and in the work. But same question: would you answer the call to church ministry in this way? Would you do it again?
I would say yes. I didn't say like I would say yes, because of the way my experience has been like a labyrinth, I guess. So when I was at MTSO, my focus in ministry and life, and even at MTSO, because that was my specialization, was in youth and young adult ministry. So I did not imagine ever being an executive pastor. That was never anything I imagined or thought I would, well, even have or and so I will say this: being here in Florida was a major change, going from Ohio to Florida, and even it happening in a pandemic. I forgot to mention this, and I would be remiss if I did not say. I served, yes, at the Fountain Church. Our lead pastor is Pastor Wayne Lomax, who started the church 25 years ago. And in this time and season, me having gone through a major shift and the church going through a major shift, I think one of the things I have learned in this season is to remove myself from absolutes, and also from not imagining, but from just, I would just say, settling into not a comfort zone. I think one of the things that I have and continue to learn in this season, doing ministry in a new place, is that we're in a time of, I would say, 3 R's. One is reimagination, because even as we re-enter the church, we can't go back. So we can't use our imagination and trying to build what was or go back to what was, but to use our imagination in what we can help form ahead. I would say reconnection and building relationships. And then, of course, reconstruction or reorganizing things that made sense pre-COVID. This is a wonderful time to allow some things to pass away and to never come back because there's a lot of energy wasted in that. But the lesson and the question of would I do it again, I would say over the last 10, 12 years since I've been at MTSO, there's been many tears, many dark days, many questions, but there's always been the adventure of doing global missions and everything like that. And so I think the lesson to seminary students is, allow doors to open, allow paths to be formed. Don't limit yourself to what you think, but open yourself to new possibilities that I believe are being formed even as the world is changing.
How consistent do you think your experience here is with other folks in ministry? TaNikka, I won't get the name of the organization right, but you're president or have been president of a large organization, Baptist Women of America, I believe.
Of North America, yes.
America. So you move and connect with folks in a lot of different churches. I assume laity and clergy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see people staying the course? Are we losing folks? And I'm not saying losing them from lives of faith,
Mm-hmm.
but what's really changed is how we organize as church. Our ecclesial structures, I think, are changing. Do you see some difference in how people are, where they're going from this point forward?
I do. I think there is great hope. I do have some sadness. There are many people and many clergy, I think, who've lost hope or who feel like they just can't take it. And some of them have left the ministries for mental health reasons, wellness reasons, just to keep their sanity reasons. Or who don't feel sustained, who feel like there's a different way I could serve God. So I have to acknowledge that, because I think that it shows that there's some issues in our systems and how in the paradigm of ministry that some people have come to believe in that just don't exist anymore, and in the expectations put on clergy that are just not human. There is just supposedly being superhuman. So that's sadness, but I also find hope in the new type of religious spaces, or the new understanding that people have of being able to be transparent and being able to put limits on things, having healthy boundaries, being able to take sabbaticals, and to be able to say, as I mentioned earlier, some of those things that we're bound by that are great traditions on paper but become burdensome. I feel that many people, and I see many clergy. I just actually came back from a conference this past week where we were having a conversation on the creation of sacred spaces. It was called From the Sofa to the Sanctuary, creating sacred spaces, reimagining, and I just keep using that word, but being aware of the needs of the people. And I challenged the group with this. Many of us had churches where we could not meet together. And so there are people who are upset that people aren't just coming back to church. But I challenge them by saying, when people imagine coming back to your church, there's an experience that they have in their mind. And maybe they're not coming back because they don't want that experience. So it's a hard truth, but the hope is that we connect with people and seek what their needs are, and don't start or end from the place of what the institution wants, but think about what it is that the people truly need.
Thank you. Andy, you move in some interesting circles too. You shared with me a couple of times a group that's important to you of clergy. I think they're mostly United Methodist pastors. My words, not yours now. It sounds like a group of high steeple preachers. Preachers, and you talked a little bit about Church of the Saviour when you're opening. One of those congregations that has a clear sense of memory. At one time, a lot of these churches would have been very, very large and in very prominent positions in the cities they serve. So these are congregations, many of which have changed already over time. What do you see about the leaders of those congregations? Everyone staying the course, or are you losing some of your colleagues?
Well, so the group that you're referring to, Jay, we call the Gathering, and it's kind of a pretentious name, I think. A gathering of, as you said, tall steeple churches. That's probably true. Many of them are downtown churches in large urban settings, but these are congregations that have a long history, or a long history of a certain standing within their conference. So when you're in that setting, the expectations are very different. There's certainly a legacy kind of expectation here. And I would say that of our group, now we typically meet in person once a year and then have a check-in at some point throughout the year. And I'm a pretty newcomer to the group, in fact, serving the smallest of the congregations within that group. So it's still pretty new to me, but we've not been able to meet in person. But what we've done, though, is pivot to more frequent conversations and sharing some of the things that we all experience in ministry, and we find that they're very similar things. A couple of us have retired or are retiring, not me, during this time. We were getting to that place anyway. Some of these folks were close to that stage of their ministry, to within this calendar year. But I think for others, the shifting reality has been hard, and I find the thing that's been helpful to me is sharing some of these ideas with people who are really, these are brilliant, innovative pastors. Certainly takes a certain level of skill, a certain kind of courage to serve with those kind of expectations on you all the time and feeling that weight of expectation, both from your bishop and from your congregants. But I've been so pleased to have that sounding board that's allowed me those conversations to move into places, the things that have become so important to us, not only the pandemic, but an increased awareness of racial justice, the space that we inhabit right now around questions of inclusion within the United Methodist Church. What does it mean to do ministry in new and innovative ways, whether we're talking about live streaming or satellite churches, or what does it mean to have people joining your church that live several states away, who will have never and maybe never will walk through the doors of your physical plant? These are very different questions than what I think we would have thought about a few years ago, and yet they are the present reality for us.
Yeah, so much of, I think we talked about this maybe 2 weeks ago, at least I was focused on it, thinking about the years I spent in local church ministry. So much of how I felt about my work, not claiming this to be a noble stance, but it had to do with how well I felt the church was doing. And so much of that was based on who was showing up. I came into the church at a time when the idea of how big your church in terms of membership was waning, and how many people were in your sanctuary on Sunday morning was the key metric for determining not only the activity level of the church, but quite frankly, the effectiveness of the pastor. I probably took put too much weight on me when things weren't going well, and took too much credit when people were there just because it was Easter or something, whatever reason people showed up for. But the reality was that was a barometer that had an impact on how I was feeling about myself and my work and my vocation. And I think maybe even to a certain extent, my spiritual life was impacted by how I understood my relationship to that pastoral work. And since we're in the Institute on Preaching, the preaching task, how well I felt I was doing at that really had an impact on how I was faring spiritually. I'll just be real honest about that. Maybe more of an impact than it should have. But let me ask this, before we get into some of the theological and homiletical challenges and opportunities, let me ask about how are you doing spiritually? Any new spiritual disciplines, practices, anything that if your heart has only been moved in the past when you hear 1,000 people sing a hymn or a praise song, you're maybe out of luck right now. So what is it that shapes your spiritual life? Andy.
Try that again. Just to pick up the theme that you talked about a minute ago, Jay, the way that our identities as pastors are often so wrapped up in the numbers or the visual representation of seeing people. We've had to get used to the idea. We had to let go of that the last couple of years, because you just weren't good, especially the first year when there was nobody here. I mean, learning to preach to a camera instead of to people in the chairs or in the pews was a big change. And I have to say, I've been helped in that process, thinking-wise, by a member of our congregation here who also happens to be an epidemiologist who I've become very close to in the last 2 years. And Dr. Stange says that he had to learn in his vocation that it was important for him to be invested in the process, but not as invested in the outcomes. And I think that on one hand, we always want to know about our effectiveness. We have to do assessment and how effective have we been in our work. But when you rely too much on the measurable outcomes in terms of our own worth, we can get into big trouble in that. And I think that's where a lot of people really get burned out or start chasing their tail a little bit too much. My own spiritual life, actually during COVID, has probably improved tremendously, because at least initially I had a lot more time to just be present with God and not be running from meeting to meeting to meeting, or the meetings were on Zoom, so I was moving from one chair to another instead of driving from home to work or to another office to do that. I would say for me, some of those spiritual disciplines that have picked up, I've become much more cognizant of my prayer life and a regular rhythm of morning prayer. That's been tremendously helpful to me. And I think the conversations with colleagues, both around the country in the gathering and with other similar sized churches here in Greater Cleveland, have been tremendous, just in terms of learning and gathering that insight. Interestingly, interfaith conversations in many cases. Some of my closest friends in ministry are rabbis here on the east side of Cleveland, and that's been tremendous to find that shared experience and where we see God at work in our lives and in our ministry has just been tremendous for me.
Amen. I would say for me, a couple of things come to mind. When I came down here, I was determined to work differently. I'm not sure if that happened, I'm going to be honest. But one of the things that we started here was, with that in mind, was a Abundant Life Wellness program here at our church, which is really helping people to prioritize their wellness in 5 major areas of our spiritual life, our emotional and mental health, our relationships, our physical health, and our financial health. And so in order to push something, you kind of got to do it. And so it has made me reprioritize every aspect of my life, because I still believe, I'm crazy enough to still believe, that the promise that we can have life and have it more abundantly is still true, even in a pandemic. And so that's been a blessing over this time. And I get convicted when I'm not operating in it. And so making decisions day by day, taking some things off of my schedule and being able to say, okay, these are, instead of the 10 things I'm going to do today, here are the 3, here are the 4, and being able to rest in that. I would say another thing when it comes to technology, when of course I don't preach. Our lead pastor does most of the preaching. I think I preach on average once a month. Like, there's a rhythm to it. But out of the church, because of the global work that I do, in 2020 I probably had booked the most preaching opportunities I've ever had in my life. I was so excited at the beginning of 2020 because my schedule was full. I was going to be traveling all over the place. And when it closed, I was like, oh no. But the miracle happened that I got even more opportunities. So I went to preaching to a camera. And instead of being nervous, I just tried to make it fun and plug in where I think somebody would clap or laugh or something like that. And so I think it actually honed my preaching skills in many ways, because there was no obvious reaction. It made me listen to myself differently. It made me really be extremely prayerful about people I don't see, and be thoughtful about everything from eye contact to facial expressions, enunciation, pronunciation, and making points clear. All of those things that we learn in homiletics class sometimes that we forget because we get comfortable in our setting was a very good just experience for me. And that's how I try to go about life. Like, every obstacle truly is an opportunity for something, whether it be growth, prayer, or, asking for help. Like, there's always an opportunity in every obstacle.
Wow. Thank you. I need to listen to that again. Have a first question coming in, and maybe I'll put that out there. We'll probably have more like this, but it has to do with now you're preaching. If it sounds like the assumption is we're preaching to people in the pews again. Having been through this experience, I'm reading into the question a little bit. Are you preaching differently? When I hear this question, I think of homiletics. The root word homileo really is about it's about conversation. The Greek term is about being in the company of, or being together with, but particularly conversing in company with others. And I find myself thinking that would have been hard for me as one who really enjoyed preaching in live space in real time, and has been adamant in the past. I probably have to rethink this, but I've never wanted to consider a sermon until it's been preached with people. And for me, that meant in the company of one another. That homileo for me was always in that, what I would say, real space with people. I've had to rethink that. Real has a broader meaning, but that sense of homileo, being in the company of others, in conversation. Now that you've been online, back in the pew, back in a sanctuary or worship space or a room, knowing some people are joining you in different ways, are you different? Either one of you.
I think for me, just a couple of things, because I was thinking about this past weekend when I was at the conference. So one of the things I think that it has made me do is, of course, look into a camera, because when you always, thank you to our audience who's online. So you have to do something for your imagined audience at the same time as your people in person. So there's those technical things. But I also think just being extremely thoughtful about the relevance of what we are saying. And for me, the connection to what is happening in real life. So I used to always still make sure, okay, who am I preaching to? So really getting to know the who and being able to identify that. But also trying to be extremely relevant with understanding what is going on in the world for them. And so if it's a point, if it's an example, trying to make sure to incorporate things that are actually happening, so people don't think this is just a message just for anybody, but hopefully they think this is a message for me, and this is a person who's speaking to me who really has at least a thought or an understanding and awareness, I would say, of things that are happening in the world, and who cares about the fact that I am experiencing hardship and I am experiencing loss, but I also love to see my team play the games. It's not all sad. And who can joke and who laugh and who takes in all of the emotions. And to be able to have the experience, that type of experience in the preaching moments.
I think that was really well said, TaNikka. I think one of the first questions we had to wrestle with at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were already set up to do live streaming in one of our spaces, so we pretty quickly shifted and just tried to do worship that encompassed all three of the styles of worship that we do in one space. But one of the first questions we had to determine was, where do we look when we preach? Are we going to lead worship as though we're still preaching to a room full of people, or are we going to look at the camera? And made the decision that in a time when people, think back to 2 years ago, March of 2020, the first few weeks of this, I mean, we were terrified. We didn't, am I going to get this thing? Or am I going to survive it? We have people dying by the thousands every day, and so that was important for us. And we made the decision to look directly at the camera, because we thought people need that intimacy, whether it's on the other side of a camera or not. They still need that eye contact. And then as people, a year later, as people started to reintroduce some people into the space and began to think, okay, so now what do we do now that there are people back? And the temptation as a preacher, like you, Jay, I think that homiletic practice, you want that conversation. You need, how's this landing with people? Is it working? And so the temptation is just to look at the people and not look at the camera. But as TaNikka said very rightly, you got to stop and think. Even if it's just at the greeting at the beginning, like, hello, those of you who are joining us online, and remembering, which camera do I look at? Which shot am I on right now? Feels a little bit like I never thought of myself as a television evangelist. It turns out I am one. And so that has changed, I think, for me. And sorry, there's some noise in the corridor at church. I couldn't get the staff to quit working while I was doing this. that has changed for me in terms of the way I think about the relationship to people. So I don't know that my preaching is markedly different than it was 2 years ago in terms of the preparation practice or the delivery, but I think one of the things I'm finding that I'm less tied to the experience of getting. TaNikka, I don't know if you experienced this or not, but I had early on with this when we were online only is that we were using our website, but we also are on Facebook Live. And so what I would find that I was doing every Sunday, I'd come home and immediately look on the church's Facebook page and try to read the comments. Did anybody say anything? Were they engaged? Did they say anything about the sermon? Did they say anything about this? And, that's maniacal. You can't live like that. So being able to say, my preaching has to be, this is the thing that I'm trying to put myself in the position of the people who are going to hear this and people who I don't even know are hearing it. But I also have to trust that if I'm being faithful to who God's calling me to be and faithful to the text that I'm preaching, that I have to let go of the outcomes of that and the way people respond to it. So if there's any change in that, maybe been a little more awareness of what I think ahead of time, where people might be on that, but then to let go of the reaction and the response, because I was driving myself crazy doing that.
On a similar topic, last week we were talking about this, and Chris George said that on the first Sunday, when everyone was still at home, we weren't even back in the sanctuaries ourselves for the most part. His, I believe, 10-year-old recorded the service on an iPhone, holding it. It sounded like he was more nervous about that, maybe because he didn't know who was behind the iPhone. He knew he was holding it, but who is watching? And then Grace and Matthew chimed in and said, well, once she got in the sanctuary, it helped her she put stuffed animals in the first few pews. So she knew where she was looking. She wanted to look at the congregation, but at the sanctuary. That's what gave her. And I'll remember for a long time her talking about before the service. She told us this last week, going pew to pew, remembering carefully who sat where and thinking about them and praying for each of her parishioners as she imagined them now in another setting as they were going to listen. But so now these many months later. You said that you want to pay attention when you're preaching to the who. How specifically do you know about the who? Are you able to? Is your congregation able to track who is coming on? Do you know? You can see now that you have some people back in the sanctuary, but assuming you have a large group still joining you online, do you know who they are? Do you have a sense when either before worship starts or after, who is with you?
Yeah, we're doing better now. So we know who the church was mostly comprised of. We also identified a target group because we are seeking to connect with a younger demographic. And so that's part of what I was thinking with the who. But then we also know those who come on. In our tradition of being an African American church, non-denominational, but I think having Baptist roots, there's a lot of amens that happen. So one of the things when I was talking about the who is we see who come on, but part of that preparation that was written and thoughtful in my sermon is telling people to put something in the chat so the conversation continues. And we continue to do that. Like if you're online, type this in the chat, let us know that you're saying things like that. And when the room was empty, back then we're only in our soft reopening. I should say that we haven't done our huge reopening that happened on Easter. But part of that over the last year and a half was when you constructing the chat or constructing the sermon is putting at least a few things that we would ask people a question about and say, go ahead and add that. Tell us what you're thinking. Have you ever experienced? So increasing the questions, doing things. I don't think that's going to go anywhere because people online like to put stuff in the chat and continue that conversation. We would pay attention to people who's writing in the chat and things like that. If someone says they're new or they've not been there before, trying to follow up. But also I would say just thinking through knowing our congregation, understanding the issues, understanding their what's happening, what we hear back from the prayer requests, what we hear from our online congregational meetings, our care group, our care teams, things that are happening like that. So that's what I meant by the who. Also, just finally understanding in the construction of the sermon. One thing I learned is to take out a time, because many of our the persons who would watch actually watch online later in the day, and because people have options now. We haven't talked about that, but people have options. We know they're not going to come back every week, at least in our congregation. They're going to watch online at least twice a month. So I've taken out like good morning and tried to put, hey, how you all doing? Because I know many of the people, because I look at our analytics, watch late at night. And so thinking about that who has been challenging, but like I said, I love a good challenge, and has made me think more expansively to the who that's watching on the other side of the world. They're not in morning time, they're somewhere else. So those are just a few of the things that this has helped us to do.
And I'd say that one of the challenges we faced is that we use the same output, but we push it out to multiple channels. So we've got it on a YouTube channel, on Facebook, and TaNikka, you're probably doing the same thing. About 80% or more of our worshiping congregation that's online is going through our website, and for the most part, the way people are watching that is on a full screen, and we have not built the rest of the tools to go around that, so that we don't have a chat feature on there right now. I mean, you are seeing the video, so it's like watching a service on television. I think that's one of our growth edges, because this technology is going to continue to be with us. We need to always, I think, from now on forever, think about both the in-person congregation and the online congregation. And I think where we are at Church of the Saviour have not developed enough sophisticated tools is around the way that we engage with that online congregation. I think that's a big change for us. I also think one of the things that we talked a little bit about, this sense of online community, and I think one of the places that I've learned and grown from this is that I think before COVID, I would have said I was pretty skeptical about, for instance, the online gaming community, or people who form groups that are based off of engagement online. I think I would have said, come on, that's not real. That's a virtual. You're using some kind of a substitute for genuine interaction. I think we've all had to learn that it is possible to have genuine community appearing online, and it's changed the way I've thought about that. And I think it's made me a better pastor to be more aware of the ways that community can take all sorts of forms. Relationships don't all look alike, and so I think that awareness has been really helpful.
Absolutely. And you know what? That being said, coming down here in the middle of the pandemic, I didn't meet. I mean, we did a soft opening first week of February. So I've met most people for the first time in a year and a half. And so I didn't meet most of probably 99% of the people except online. And and when I did meet them in person, I could only see half of a face. So I would joke with people. Say, I met you before. I would say, well, cover up. Let me just see. Okay, I understand because they would have on a mask. But with that, we have small groups at our church, and I wrestled because even if we tried to go, at least the group I started, even if we wanted to go back into in person, we cannot, because like my small group has people from 4 states in there. So we can't, there's no way to do things like that anymore. But it's such a blessing because the connection and the prayers and it's very real. It's absolutely real and genuine.
As you're talking about interactions with people, I see that we have a comment in the chat about trolls, and this pastor has somebody who an IT person who's watching for trolls. Probably times I wish I'd had that in live worship too. But in the early days of the pandemic, I know we talked a little bit about Zoom bombing and how do you protect against people entering the space and being inappropriate or disruptive. There are times that I might almost find myself welcoming disruption or interaction, not harmful or hurtful, but is there any sense that, first of all, how do you experience interactions? You mentioned earlier the call and response, TaNikka, in the Baptist tradition. I think that's missed in a lot of places. In the tradition I raised, call and response meant a very subtle nod, a nod, or maybe a crossing of the arms if it wasn't a positive reaction to the sermon. But I welcomed that because it was something. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we don't want someone trolling in a negative way, but what do you do to encourage a little interaction, particularly now going forward, if it's a reality that there are going to be some people online while we're preaching, some people in real space. How do you get that interaction? How do you get that? Because there's something special when I had preached in a congregation with a call and response tradition, and then I go back to a congregation that doesn't have that, I'm missing something. There's something about preaching that comes alive when you know someone's listening. And so how are those interactions fostered?
Oh yeah, and I want to name our lead pastor. I would talk with him about this all the time, because when you're in a pandemic and the room is empty except a few people, it is hard. It is something that is deeply missed, is the conversation during the homiletics moment. One thing that helped me, and this, I don't know, it probably sounds crazy now. I think I named our cameras people. Like one was George, Martha, Ed. So I had to do it so that when I turned into the cameras, I actually gave them names. But to keep up the interaction, I try to be very thoughtful about the question. So when writing the sermon, to make it a very simple questions have been very helpful. If it's in person, they can raise their hand. Or just nod your head if you're with me. Things like that encourage but aren't too much. There aren't compound questions. I think are very helpful, and that will keep the flow. But if you ask the question, give it enough time for people to think about it, and then keep it moving. But once again, I think not having too many questions, because that becomes a burden on the people.
Yeah. We've a couple of things that have helped here. When we were first in the space where there were no congregants in person, we only had our production team. So we had a couple of musicians, we had our tech crew and clergy. And in our case, that we had 3 or 4 of us who were here that were clergy people. So what would happen was that when one of us would preach, the others of us knew that person needed some input, and so we actually were much more verbal than certainly than we are with people around. So interestingly, in those early days, I probably had more direct feedback from my colleagues who were around me when I preached, and did the same for them when they were preaching, than what we do at other times. The other thing is a few times with pretty good effect through this pandemic cycle, we've used Menti, online polling, which can work really well. It becomes we can't do it in our sanctuary. Well, we can do it in our sanctuary, but I have to read the responses to people because we don't have screens in there. But for those who are online, that can be a real equalizer, because you talk about bringing together people who are on their smartphones or their devices in the sanctuary, and people are on their devices at home, and they're all interacting in real time with each other. And so there's a sense that brings that together. So we don't use it often. We've probably only a handful of times, but those little moments have sometimes worked really effectively. Again, like you said, TaNikka, you don't want to ask too many questions of people. That's a technology you can overuse it, and overusing your strength can become a weakness. So we don't do that very often, but I think when we do, those things can be really effective.
but it is using Mentimeter. It is a technology. You don't want to overuse it, but it's one that you can do if your church doesn't have a lot of tech infrastructure to start with, because you're basically, people are using their own devices. Raheem, I saw your comment about you're doing a shout out to see if anyone knows anyone in Detroit. Let's resource each other. If people know, I'm guessing based on what you said, to elderly, technology challenged congregations, I'm guessing you're not the only one participating today, Raheem, who has that experience. And if anyone's out there who can help with that resourcing, that's one of the things we can do with and for each other, I think. But that would be, I would think, a different kind of challenge. If you're a small congregation, can sometimes have a lot of technologically savvy people in it. That's certainly not the issue. But if you don't have an experience of doing that as church, it may be a whole new thing. But I imagine, I mentioned last week or the week before how pleased my 94-year-old mother is with how churches are doing worship now. She has been in assisted living for a number of years. And as I shared, maybe it was last week, I used to be really frustrated participating in worship with her when I was visiting her in Illinois, because the worship that she was experiencing online just wasn't very good. Sometimes the camera was turned off. Sometimes the sound was either too loud or too quiet. But now, after 2 years of pandemic, church is pretty good. So she's grateful. So here's somebody to assume that we're a congregation that maybe hasn't done a lot of technology. Probably shouldn't assume that the people can't do it. My mother wouldn't have guessed that she would be an active worship participant through her iPad, but she has been, and even more so now, now that we've met her halfway and are as good at it as she needs us to be.
I think I want to give a shout out too to a member of our congregation who probably would have had to make the shift to online worship at some point during this time anyway, who's caring for a roommate with needs that preclude her being able to come. And when we were a couple weeks ago in the conversation, then just exchanged some messages around that, and we were talking about the challenges of worshiping at home, and how one of the concerns is that people got really accustomed to worshiping at home, and so you might be on the couch in your pajamas with a cup of coffee or whatever, or the joke I always make is, when the sermon starts, they get up and vacuum the floor or something. It's on, but are they actually engaged with it? But Connie she told me that one of the things that has helped her is that worshiping online requires a different mindset, and so you have to create for yourself. I think when I've worshipped online, that you have to create for yourself an environment that says, I'm entering into worship now. So yeah, it's on, but am I approaching this the same way I would approach it if I were in the sanctuary, in the worship space? And so creating, and for a lot of us, like Colleen mentioned, using a candle as a way to be present in worship, or maybe that was Grace last week. I can't remember who it was that talked about using a candle, but whatever it is, create a space, get ready. Get yourself ready. Don't just roll out of bed and flip the thing on. Create that intentional space. And then if you do that, and what Connie was saying is, by doing that, she has found that online worship is really meaningful for her. And so I'm grateful to have that opportunity.
Absolutely. I think for me, I'll say quickly, I think one of the things we learned even recently is that, I'm not sure who said it first, but sometimes the solutions of yesterday are the reason for the problems today. And so we were, of course, for safety reasons, when we first when I came to the church, and for safety reasons, everyone was recording separately, the music, because of the safety, and then someone will put together the service post-production. Well, we got used to doing a really, really good post-production experience and streaming it live. Doing the live stream. Well, when we came back in person, we had to stream live. And I just give encouragement to anyone else who's had those issues that people are not used to hearing live singers. They're used to hearing post-produced music or just things being smooth. And so these last 6 weeks have been, I would call, an adventure. Many tears because of things like that, things not going well. But I encourage anyone who is having those types of issues to just be encouraged, because the learning that happens in those spaces, the opportunities for people to serve, and just being able to do something new each and every week is a great thing. But yeah, that was probably one of the things that probably over the last 8 weeks have been my greatest opportunity for prayer. Is live streaming from our sanctuary and reopening, of course.
It's harder to say, I didn't say that right. Can we do that take again?
I have a question that's come directly to my cell phone in the form of a text. This comes from a retired pastor, one of the better preachers and Christian educators I know, who's now a participant in church, but I think probably visits a number of different churches, like many of us, online and maybe some in person, but that sense of connection may not be there anymore. How can I, she asks, move from being a member of an audience to truly connecting with a congregation? She reminds me that when she was part of starting a new church, she kept the hymnals in the trunk of her car. So people would definitely miss her if she didn't show. Now she's not so sure people miss her. What can we do to connect? Here's someone who was in the center of church leadership for a long and wonderful ministry, who's feeling a little bit on the outside. I would guess a lot of us probably are wondering, how do we connect?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. By the way, Jay, so for people who are finding the Q&A or the chat not working, you're gonna share your cell phone number so everybody can send their questions directly to you, right?
I can put it out there. Jared, go ahead and do the chat. If the question and answer is not working, folks, go ahead and use the chat, because that clearly is working.
Yeah. So I mean, I think part of this it is both the responsibility of the church to help to facilitate those relationships, and I think almost, or maybe even more importantly, it's the responsibility of the congregant to find those opportunities. So I say that as though that's an easy thing to do, and I don't mean to make light of it, but I do think if I were in the place of a congregant who was not in person in a church, or even just finding my way back into a congregation, I think one of the important things to do is to find other people who you can be in community with. So in a larger church setting, or in a setting where everybody's online and you don't see those people, that emphasizes the importance of a small group or some kind of a sounding board. And I would maybe suggest connecting with a few other people and finding a way to just can we have a 30-minute Zoom call after the worship service? Just talk about what we heard or what we experienced or what's going on in our lives, and pray for each other. And if you don't have those relationships within the congregation, that's a place where, as a worshiper, you could contact the staff of the church and say, I'm looking for this. I'm thinking there may be some other people. Could you help connect me with? As I can say, as a pastor, I love it when somebody says, I'd like to be part of a small group, but I don't know how to get into that. Can you help me? That's huge, because I feel like what often happens is we're trying to create small group communities, and it's not connecting with people. So I think it's a both and, but that, to me, that's a huge piece, whether you're in a worship setting in person or online, to find a handful of other people that you can take that conversation and go deeper with it. To me, that's when genuine faith community really happens.
Absolutely. I was going to say something similar about small groups, and just, if you don't have a church, finding a congregation that whose values you align with, or a faith tradition you align with. And I know many congregations who are in need of persons with wisdom and experience, and who could just provide that type of wisdom and experience, whether it be in prayer circles, or whether it be, helping with, I'm not sure exactly what she's looking for, but I know that mission outreaches, even if it's one day a week, to help in those arenas and areas, it can always be utilized. When I talk to different persons right now and about finding a faith community, some of them have found more connection somehow with people states away than they found with the local congregations. And so the one thing I just tell them is just make sure you're able to serve, to support financially, to grow, and also be able to connect with prayer. And it's amazing. I would encourage congregations, if they really want a healthy online experience, to think through what online membership means, or virtual membership. And if that means I give, that's one thing, but also, are there groups available? Is there prayer? And most important, I won't say most importantly, but I think something that's left out is, what is my ministry? How can I support the church and not be in person? So I know people are looking for tech support. Sometimes those persons who are watching online wouldn't mind serving by being chat support or serving virtually. No one has ever made the ask to them, so they're on there every single week, but people just don't ask. So those are just things that may be helpful.
Another question that came into to me specifically here was, what do you want to see on for good? And I think you touched on that early on, TaNikka, but you didn't expound. Maybe that's what people are wanting to know. What are you talking about? Let's be honest with each other here.
Let me think. I don't know if Andy has some off the top of his head, but let me.
I got a long list.
Let me think. A couple would be, I encourage churches to get rid of the supposed to mindset, which is, you are supposed to show up to church. You're supposed to do that. People have options. They are supposed to love God and each other. But some of those things we weigh. I would say get rid of things and events and things that were only happening because they meant something to people who are no longer there. To reimagine how church finances are used. I would say get rid of, how does Pastor Romatt say it? Stop funding nostalgia. So to get rid of these, is just like anything that you do that the only answer you can have is because that's how we've always done it. I would say that would be a great list. But also to some constraints, any ministries that are no longer needed or wanted. If you have to push and bamboozle people into doing it, or bully people almost into doing it, that may be something to just reconsider, that it lived its day and there's a space now for something new.
I had a friend a few years ago who asked the question, are we trying to train people to be good churchgoers, or are we training people to be disciples of Jesus?
Absolutely.
And they're not necessarily the same thing, right? And we all have cultures of church wherever your setting is. Mm-hmm. And I agree, TaNikka, the idea that funding legacy things, funding memories, it's doing the same thing that we're doing because that's what that's how we do it here. I think those days are gone. We can't function that way anymore. We have to think about, is this serving a need? Is this actually advancing the mission of what it means to be the church? I think I was just reading again a passage in Gil Rendell's book, Quietly Courageous, and he said good leadership involves being more afraid of not meeting the mission than it is ticking off the people who have expectations of you and wherever you serve. That's not the way he said it. He was much more eloquent. But this idea that are we more beholden to the preferences of people around us, or to actually achieving the mission that we set out to do? And until we're more concerned about not meeting that mission than we are about offending the people around us, we're gonna struggle. And so I feel like COVID's given us a huge opportunity for that, and we talk about it all the time around here as staff. okay, we can start doing this again, can't we? Well, okay, we could start doing it again, but why would we start doing it again? Is it something we want to do? For instance, the one of the questions that we're wrestling with now is when do we start having coffee hour again? Well, what does it mean to have coffee hour? And you know, how is that time advancing what we're trying to do? And I think it does in many ways. But if we just simply go back to, well, this is how we did it before, let's just do it that way again, we've missed a golden opportunity to really rethink the function of the things that we do. And that's just one example. The other one I was going to say, TaNikka, that on my long list is this committee meets every month in person, whether we have an agenda or not. Like, no, no. And I think, you know, the cycle of meetings, and the need to do those meetings and hash through that. The other one I want to let go of. Can we please let go of Robert's Rules of Order? I've just had it. Right. It was a long time ago when he wrote those rules. And my God, there are so many more important ways for us to do holy conferencing and to make decisions within a community of believers in Jesus. That, come on, we got to do better than this.
Well, fortunately, as a United Methodist, Andy, you don't need Robert's Rules of Order. Discipline.
Right, which has served us so well over the last few years. You know, the question that always comes up in United Methodist circles now is like, so for instance, are we going to elect bishops or not? Well, does the discipline allow us to do that? We're going to violate the discipline if we elect bishops and we haven't had a general conference. Well, we already violated the discipline by not even having the general conference. It says we're going to have it. It doesn't say if you can. So we've already violated it. Can we be intentional about how we're going to break those rules? Now is a time for really rethinking all of that stuff. So I hope, for just this as an aside, but I hope whatever the United Methodist Church does coming out of General Conference in 2024 now, I hope one of the lessons that we've learned is being too specific in our rules puts us in a real bind, and we need to leave a lot more room for the church to be the church and not be so specific about how we limit the ways God can move in our midst.
Amen. Can I just echo, no more unnecessary in-person meetings, especially with the gas prices where they are, and even before that, looking at our environment. It's just a waste of time. So I just concur with, I just wanted to say that it's just so important. So important.
There are probably people in the world who find value in meetings, and we should be to be serious. There are aspects of meetings that bring people together who don't otherwise get that connection. That maybe is the highlight of the week because it's the one interpersonal connection they have. So we need to remember that. But I'm with the two of you on my life feels better now that and almost all the meetings of my life are online. They're to the point and they tend to be more effective. I do have a text here, Andy. I think this is directed to you. Keep the cookies, I believe, is what this person is saying. Food is a part of Jesus' ministry always.
Just let them be good cookies, not those terrible over hard cookies that you buy like at the gas station convenience store. Can we just make sure that if we're gonna have cookies, let's have good ones? Jesus would be pleased.
And you know what, Jay? I think it's important to tell people there's nothing wrong with connection and fellowship. I think if they need fellowship, let's do fellowship, and that way the business stays the business meeting, and we encourage more connecting with people and fellowship. I was going to say this earlier. One of the things that we started here, we're not just small groups because that was been happening, but one of the things is wellness communities, which are online through our app, but they give people, so we have one called the Fountain Steppers, where all we do is log our steps every day, but we encourage people to join those first who may not want to join a small group or something like that. We have one emerging called Fountain Foodies, I guess, where those people who take pictures of their food or want to share the best restaurants or whatever. So I think having different imaginations of connection is really important. And that way, like I said, business stays business necessarily, but I think that's something that we really need to do is find more connection points for people.
I'm hearing here again via text from somebody about a pastor who is doing Zoom discussions of the sermon after church on Sunday, presumably for people who were connecting both online and in person, but a live interaction about the preached word. I would think that would be.
It's a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah, we did it once. We tried to put it back on the schedule. It just hasn't happened. But something called Sermon Cafe, where people get to come back, and if you have coffee or something, but you can come and ask your questions about. That one was more controversial sermon, but the hope is more sermons moving forward to make that a regular piece.
I remember years ago doing for a while we did a Wednesday night service where I intentionally preached the same text that I would preach, usually a lectionary passage, not always, that I would preach the following Sunday, and we'd have kind of a talkback session after the Wednesday night service, and then email interaction after that. We called it Build a Sermon, and people were able to participate. And some of the questions and comments that came after a Wednesday night mediocre stab at a sermon really did make for something, I think, better on Sunday. So that interaction, again, we were talking earlier, whether it's call and response, but to make sure our congregations are in our preaching, both inspiring what we're doing, understanding our context, who we're preaching to, but also helping shape what happens. It's a shared spoken word.
Well, Jay, you'll go to great lengths to get out of writing a sermon.
Yeah, if I can get someone else to do it. Well, what other things? I don't see any additional questions coming up. Someone has just commented on the conversation, but anything that we're missing? Any questions out there from any folks? TaNikka, Randy, anything? Any closing comments? We have about 2 minutes left.
Well, one of the things we haven't talked a lot about is, we focused throughout on racial on the pandemic and the effects of COVID. I think one of the things that to me has been so extraordinary about this time is that when George Floyd was killed, that's a moment that caught people's attention. And I think that one of the reasons it caught people's attention was because we had so much attention to give to it. You think about how many times, we can make a long list of the names, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, a whole list of people who were killed in a situation that shouldn't have happened. And there were protests, or there would be some attention to it, but then a couple of days later it was gone. And I think what happened with George Floyd was, because we were in this, and I apologize, that was a real rapid shift of gears, but I think it's been an extraordinary moment because the alignment of the pandemic and our increased awareness of racial injustice in this country, the effort around Black Lives Matter and becoming more intentionally anti-racist. It was huge for our congregation to meet that moment. And I think one of the biggest reasons is we were at home. We weren't at work. We had time, and it was all over the news. And because we were watching the news constantly, we were seeing this over and over. And I think finally some of that, at least for a significant period of time, that finally caught on to people that, wait a minute, I can't just ignore this anymore. Like, I have to pay attention to it. And I think it for us in this congregation, it's been a real game changer to have had that awareness, to have increased in that way. And I'm so grateful. I mean, we talk all the time about things that we lost during COVID. I think some of the things that we gained during COVID have also been huge for us. And I hope that the learning time and the discovery that's come out of this, whether it's technology or around issues of race, or the ways that we relate to one another, the epidemic of loneliness that was with us long before the pandemic and will be with us long after it. I think these are really important conversations, and I'm really grateful that we've had these moments to grow in that way.
Amen. I thank you so much, Andy, for bringing that up. I would echo some of that in my final words, I guess. Dr. Willie Francois was at the Lot Carey meeting along with me, did an amazing job talking about social justice. And one thing I would push us to do is to help people to know that it's a lifestyle of, because after our protests and after our conversations, people, the policies are still there, the systems are still there. You know, I was challenged this past weekend to be reminded of that, choose an issue and to continue to work at it until change happens, not until we get tired or until promises are made, but until change happens. When it comes to the issue of justice for those who have the continual list of people like George Floyd and Tamir Rice and many, many, many others, is the tragedy of the fact that we should never have known their names. They should not be famous. They should have been able to live their lives and continue to live. And so I think if that is a way we choose, and we should choose to live out our faith, it is our work as followers of Christ to continue to provide opportunities for us to seek those changes and not to be satisfied with simple gestures, but continue to work. And that work is often a risk to us because it may turn people away. But if our faith and following Christ aligns with seeking justice and speaking and advocating on behalf of the voices that are very rarely heard, then we need to continue to incorporate that in our ministry and in our mission.
Let's let that be our final word and our charge. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both. Peace, friends.
Thank you.